Hello everyone and welcome to a most exciting game from round 5 of the Fide Grand Prix currently being played in Belgrade, but also a really weird game because it gets, it gets to a point of actually winning the game, before the move 10 has even been reached pretty much. So it's kind of cool in that perspective, but also it doesn't end there, but it lasts for some 60 moves. Now, much like in game 4, all of the games in round 5 ended in a draw, except for this one that may or may not have ended in a draw. We'll have to check it out and see what actually happened. So it's Vidit versus Rapport. Let's see what's going on here. So e4, we have e6. Rapport goes for the French defense. We have d4, d5, and now e5. Vidit goes for the advanced variation of the French, and now c5. So very principled, striking in the center as white overextended with e5, and now c3. Just perfecting the setup here, and now queen to b6, putting more pressure to the center here, putting pressure on b2, so white has some trouble developing the bishop here. This is a very popular. Knight to c6 still by far the most popular, but queen to b6 also incredibly popular. Knight to f3 and bishop to d7. Now this is the weight variation of the French, and the idea is to trade one pawn in the center and play bishop to b5 and trade off white's light square bishop. As white's light square bishop, you know, it can be an incredibly strong piece in the, against the French defense, and black's light square bishop will not be doing all that much. So best just trade it off right away. That's the idea. Bishop to e2, and now c captures on d4. We have c captures and bishop to b5. So the bishop trade is being offered here. We have bishop captures with check, queen captures, and knight to c3 now. Attacking the queen here. Queen to a6, Rapport not allowing Vidit to castle, and Vidit plays a4. So there are a couple of games that reach this exact same position, and a couple of other moves have been played here, but a4, not this one. So it's now as of move 10 that we have a completely new game. Here we have bishop to b4, not allowing knight to b5, because with a4, Vidit would like to play knight to b5, so the white king will be able to castle, and you will have an excellent outpost for the knight. As black does not have a c-pawn, so he will not be able to kick it away, at least not while the queen is on a6, and a6 cannot be played. So here, bishop to d2, unpinning, and now bishop captures on c3, so not allowing that knight to b5, bishop captures, and now knight to e7, going after that beautiful f5 square, as the light square bishops have been taken off the board, and now b4. Vidit now says, alright, I'm playing b5, and then I'm definitely castling, and Rapport says, nope, that's not happening. He's playing queen to c4, still keeping an eye on this diagonal, so not allowing castles and putting pressure on the bishop. But not a problem. We have rook to c1, and now knight b to c6. And here's when the fun really starts. So, okay, I said that the game reaches a critical point already in the opening on move 10. It's actually move 14, but still, it's, I mean, completely crazy for a classical game. So feel free to pause the video here and try to find, a completely mad idea for white while I give you a couple of seconds to give white a chance at a winning position. So have at it. So for those of you who were able to do it, congratulations on realizing this incredible truth, as this is incredibly hard to find. And for those of you who just want to enjoy the show, it is knight to d2. That's the move. Vidit did not play it because, it's so ugly and so complicated and seemingly impossible to calculate that it seems that you'll just spend all of your time calculating this and, still not be done with all of the lines. But to give it to you as briefly as possible. Okay, now black's queen is attacked. We have to move the queen somewhere. Not a lot of squares for the queen. You can't go to a6, then b5, and that's game. So here, queen to d3 would be played, and now comes the move you had to see, and that is pawn to b5. And what do you do here? Well, obviously you capture the pawn. Other lines aren't all that impressive, but capturing the pawn is the best idea for black. And after knight captures on d4, now comes the move you really had to see, and that's the really hard one, and that is h4. And now when you see rook coming to h3, you see that the knight here really doesn't have all that much to do, because once rook h3 comes, we're going to have to move the queen, and you're going to lose the knight. And if you try to save the knight, let's say you try something like knight to f5, well, then it's even worse. Now comes rook h3, and now you've taken away the 2 squares the black queen could actually use to get away from the rook, and now you just lose the queen. So there's nothing to be done here. So what you would have to do after this h4 move is maybe try play knight captures on b5, give up the knight for these 2 pawns because you already grabbed 1 pawn, and then start marching your pawns forward. But here white would just play bishop to b2 and say rook h3 is still coming, and your knight still has no squares. Rook covers c7, pawn covers d6. Where is your knight going? Nothing to play here for black. So once you castle, rook h3 is coming, and then after something like queen g6, we're going to play rook g3 first, harass the queen a bit more, and after queen to h6, we're going to play even rook to g4, guard our pawn here, and the knight still has no squares. And let's say knight g6 goes after the h4 pawn. Now we capture on b5, and finally after knight captures on h4, you get king to f1. We have to put the king on g1 all the way, so we don't have to worry about queen to h1, but all in all here white is just up a piece. Yes, okay, you don't have an h pawn, but your king will be very safe here, and white is completely winning here. So after knight b to c6, Rapport allowed this, but who would see this? If you found knight to d2, that's incredibly impressive. If you found the 3 ideas, knight to d2, b5, and h4, allowing the rook to come to h3, then you truly, sir, are an incredible player. So here, instead of knight to d2, bishop to d2 was played, opening up an attack against Rapport's queen, but now queen to d3, and now b5 doesn't really do anything because you cannot connect it with h4, rook coming to h3. There's a knight on f3, so rook h3 will really be doing nothing. So here, queen e2, offering a queen trade, and Rapport declines this very politely with queen to a3. And now, again, what do you play here? Well, here Vidit just castled, but now was also a good time to play b5, but still, it's not easy to realize why, because after knight to a5, which is well, silly move because it's hanging, but it's really not, because the bishop has to guard the rook on c1. So if captures, queen's going to capture here. So we would see rook to c7, putting pressure on the b7 and the e7 square. And now knight to c4, closing up the c file. So now we're going to chase the rook here. And after, let's say, castles, we're going to play king d8. And after a rook captures on b7, king to c8. And now you will have to give up the exchange. But okay, let's say bishop c1, queen goes somewhere. And now rook captures on e7, queen captures. We would get this position where white sacrificed the exchange, but white also has a very, very promising position with the king being wide in the open, so this would be favorable for white. But okay, here we have after queen to a3, we have castles, and now comes knight to f5. This knight will now enjoy being here very much. You don't have a light square bishop, so the only way to kick it away is to play g4, and well, white not interested in doing that just yet. And now you don't have b5 anymore, because now the knight can just capture, as this knight is also attacking the d4 square. So bishop c3, Vidit defends. Now comes rook to c8. We have g4. You have to get rid of this knight, otherwise the black's position is just too powerful. Knight f to e7, and now bishop back to d2, opening up the c file. And here we have h5. Interestingly, if you go after the b4 pawn, as the pawn is hanging, there's trouble for black here, because there's rook to a1. And now once, let's say we trade queens, captures, we're going to play rook f to b1, and you will lose the b7 pawn. So that's not really good for black, because if you try to defend it, let's say play b6, then rook b3, and you lose the knight. Again, no squares for the knight. The pawns are just so nicely placed. So instead, after bishop d2, Rapport strikes with h5. He says, all right, now g4 has been made a target. G captures on h5, and now queen captures on a4. We have rook to a1, attacking the queen, queen back to c2, and now b5. So finally, this b5 move is played. Knight to d8. The knights, seemingly terribly placed, are actually doing a good job at keeping everything safe. Rook f to c1, attacking the queen, and queen to f5. Now, Vidit trades a pair of rooks. We have rook captures, knight captures, and now rook to c1, putting pressure on the knight, but knight just goes back, knight to e7. And here, as the c7 square is now available, Vidit goes for the rook lift. You could choose between a rook c7 and bishop to b4. Those are the two moves you want to play. Vidit starts with rook to c7. We have rook captures on h5, now bishop to b4, pressuring the knight on e7, now knight to g6. And here, finally, b6, but now, okay, you are making some progress here. You want to play queen to b5 check, but the problem is black is already up a pawn, and now you give black an opportunity to be up 2 pawns, and Rapport does not allow this opportunity to pass. He just plays queen to b1 check. And now look at this. Okay, if the king goes to g2, then we just play knight f4 check and we win the game on the spot. So you have to block check with the queen. So queen to e1 was played, and now we have a trade here. Queen captures, knight captures, and a captures on b6. And now you have this position where it's 6 black pawns against 4 white pawns, and that's quite a lot. So here we have knight to c2. Now comes rook to h3, activating the rook, preparing to shift the rook over to the queen side. We have bishop to d6, an excellent square for the bishop. Unfortunately, it's not going to be doing all that much here. Knight to c6 now, offering the b7 pawn for some counterplay against the d4 pawn. So rook capture, and here going for the capture right away might not be the best course of action. Maybe best is just to play rook c8 check, and now after, let's say, knight to d8, bring the rook back to c7 and force black to find a different plan. But okay, Vidit played rook captures on b7 right away, and now we have rook to c3, attacking the defender of the d4 pawn, knight to e3, and now even knight to h4. So first we're gonna improve the position of our knight before going after the pawn, and now king to f1. Here, if you go for rook captures here, then knight captures here, nothing really good there for white. So instead, rook to b3 was played, and now comes knight to c2. We have rook to b2 attacking the knight. Now comes knight to a3. We have knight f5 going after the d4 pawn. Now comes bishop to c5 defending, and now finally knight f captures on d4. And now, okay, now you could capture on b6, but this is a lost endgame. Rook captures, bishop captures. After knight f3, you attack this pawn and this pawn, so white will have to give up one of them. Let's say h4, knight captures here, you're up 2 pawns. Of course, this is completely winning. So instead, after knight f captures on d4, we have h4. The pawn will be a little bit safer there, but still, knight f5 goes after the pawn. Bishop to d6 now, as this pawn also needs to be defended, and now rook b3 puts pressure on the knight. We have knight to c2. Now comes d4. Now Rapport starts pushing his pass pawn. King to e1. Now knight captures on h4. So everything is winning here for black. It's only a matter of technique. So f4. We have knight to f3 check. King to f2. Now comes knight captures on e5. Even this is possible because the knight will be the knight cannot escape the rook. So f captures on e5. Now comes rook to b2, attacking the knight. The knight cannot move, of course. King to f3, rook captures on c2, and now rook captures on b6. We have rook to c3 check, king to f4, and now f6. So there are no moves here for white. We have e captures on f6, g captures rook to b7. But even though with such a beautifully active rook and the bishop nicely placed on d6, there just aren't any threats here for white. So rook to c4, going for some discoveries here. Now comes bishop to a3 and rook to a4, going after the bishop, bishop to c1, and finally rook to a7, chasing the rook away from the 7th rank. You can win this a lot of ways, but this is the safest one. Rook to b6 and king to d7. We have king to e4. Now comes f5 with check. King to d3, and of course e5. The pawns are now marching forward very nicely. King to c4, now comes king to d6, bishop to d2, but now rook to a2, attacking the bishop, and finally bishop to b4 check, king to c7 attacks the rook, and bishop to c5 defending, rook to c2 check, king to d5, you have to guard the bishop, and now knight to e7 check. And he was in this position on move 61 that Vidit resigned the game, as there is nothing more to be done here. Once the knight is captured, nothing is guarding your rook, so it's pretty much simple as that. Captures, and once you capture here, we can even play rook e2 check and pick up the bishop here and just push our pawn to victory. And other moves don't really help Vidit all that much. If king to e6, we can just capture on c5. Now the rook is hanging. If king captures on e7, you're just down a whole rook. And lastly, for example, after this knight to e7 check, you could capture on e5, but still, just rook captures on c5 check, pretty much the same thing. Captures here, we're going to capture here. This is the worst of the three, of course. So after knight e7 check, Vidit resigned, and a beautiful victory for Rapport in round 5 of the Belgrade Fide Grand Prix. So we'll see what happens. Today is the final round before the knockout. So I think Anish still has the lead. Pretty sure about that. Maybe Rapport caught up to him, but if not, it's either Anish or Rapport and Anish. That's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. And again, special congratulations to anyone who found knight f2 d2 here. And the following ideas. This is just an incredible position that I think both of them will remember for a very long time. That's the game. Hope you guys enjoyed it. I would like to thank Gregory Boschko, you for buying from clothesbox.com. Congrats for the new job, Elizabeth Coco Meow Meow. Greetings from Zdravko Bus and Zulong for your contribution to my channel. Thank you a lot. I really appreciate it. As usual, you can check two of my previous videos here. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you soon, continuing the coverage of the Grand Prix until it finishes. Thank you all. I will see you soon, and have an excellent rest of your day.